Welcome to the Existentialist Society in Melbourne, Australia. Existentialism is an umbrella term covering diverse and often conflicting schools of thought. Consequently, we are not agreed on who or what is an existentialist. We simply agree to disagree. I'm David Miller, the Secretary of the Existentialist Society, and our speaker today is Associate Professor Patrick Stokes from Deakin University, and his topic is The Road to Martyrdom, Kierkegaard versus Schopenhauer. Patrick.
Thank you very much, David. And hello, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many people here. I'm just going to share my screen there. I will say it's really delightful to be back at the Existentialist Society for what I think is my fourth or fifth turn, actually. Originally, I think as a young, fresh-faced, recent PhD graduate, which feels like an awfully long time ago now. So lovely to be back. I'm speaking today on land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I offer my respects to their elders past and present. Today's talk is a summary of, I'm going to try very hard not to just read the paper. I think these things are always better if you talk to the paper. But it is a written chapter, which is forthcoming in a book called The Schopenhauerian Mind. If people are not familiar with this series, it's a series of edited collections that Routledge are putting together. I was asked a few years ago Routledge approached me to say, would you do the Kierkegaardian Mind in this series? And by the way, they're like 40 chapters long and about 400 pages in length. It's like 250,000 words or something. And I said, okay, I'll do it, but not on my own. So I roped in a couple of friends of mine as co-editors, and we edited this mammoth book. So I felt enormous amount of sympathy and solidarity when David Bay the Woods emailed to ask, would I be prepared to do something on Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer for the Schopenhauerian Mind, the next volume in the series. And it also gave me an opportunity to talk about these two figures who I've done a lot of work on Kierkegaard. My PhD was on Kierkegaard. I've sort of moved on to other things. But not long after PhD, I did do a little paper in a very obscure little publication called Acta Kierkegaardiana on what happens in 1854 when Kierkegaard reads Schopenhauer at length for the first time and what he writes in his journals about it. And so it was a really good opportunity to go back to that material to sort of reconsider some of what I'd said in the past about these two figures, and to try and re-examine and re-articulate that sort of interesting sort of clash / appreciation that occurs when Kierkegaard comes to read Schopenhauer. Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer, of course, are two of the three big eccentric major figures of 19th century European philosophical writing, the other, of course, being Nietzsche. Schopenhauer's impact on Nietzsche is pretty well documented and understood because, of course, Schopenhauer himself documents it in his text, Schopenhauer's Educator, and in other places throughout his text. And, of course, Nietzsche was far too young to have had any influence on Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer dies in 1861, likewise with Kierkegaard, who dies in 1855. Schopenhauer sadly never reads Kierkegaard. Neither does Nietzsche, by the way. Georg Brandes famously writes to Nietzsche in 1888 and says, you know what, you should really read Nietzsche. He's very, very Christian, but he's got some really cool, interesting things to say about philosophical psychology, and I think you'll really get something out of Kierkegaard. Nietzsche writes back to Brandes saying, next time I'm in Berlin, I propose to investigate the psychological problem of Kierkegaard. And unfortunately, about a month or 2 months after he writes that letter, he has his infamous encounter with a horse in Turin, and his major mental decline begins, and he never actually gets a chance to read Kierkegaard. So and Schopenhauer never gets to read Kierkegaard because Schopenhauer dies in 1861. The first full-length German language editions of Kierkegaard don't begin to appear until the 1860s, and even then they're very limited. The German language reception of Kierkegaard begins quite a bit later than that in earnest, and really takes off around World War I with the Brenner Press editions coming out of Innsbruck. So that leaves Kierkegaard reading or receiving Schopenhauer, if there's going to be any contact between these other figures. And in fact, we know that does happen. Happens around 1854 in a series of journal entries. Kierkegaard's aware of Schopenhauer earlier than that because his favorite teacher, Paul Martin Möller, was teaching a bit of Schopenhauer to his students in the 1890s, 1820s, 1810s, 1820s, and mentions him in some of his writings as well. So Kierkegaard has a kind of background awareness of Schopenhauer. He knows he existed, but he doesn't actually really come to read him until 1854 in what turns out to be the final 12 months or so of his life, or final 18 months of his life. Despite this lack of direct contact, they're both, or late contact in Kierkegaard's case, they're both eerily similar. And as we'll see shortly, even Kierkegaard himself thought so. They're both kind of outlier figures in 19th century thought. They're outliers to their respective ecclesiastical and academic establishments in Denmark and Germany, respectively. They both have a very ambivalent relationship to other major kind of institutions in their society. Both of them hated their fellow professors, or their fellow professors in the case of Schopenhauer. Both of them hated journalists. Above all else, both of them are incredibly critical of Hegel. Kierkegaard actually is often regarded as a sort of arch critic of Hegel, but actually his criticism of Hegel is much more nuanced and indeed appreciative. He's heavily influenced by Hegel, whereas Schopenhauer famously just derides Hegel as a charlatan. And you probably know the infamous story that Schopenhauer, when he arrived in Berlin, was scheduled to lecture at the same time as, was scheduled to lecture and deliberately set up his lectures so they were scheduled at the same time as Hegel's. So Schopenhauer's idea there being that students had to choose. They could either go and see the great charlatan Hegel, or they could go and see Schopenhauer delivering the truth. And of course, Hegel was a rock star. Schopenhauer was a nobody. All the students went to see Hegel, and so he was lecturing to virtually empty rooms. But beyond that too, they're also, by the way, I would say both outstanding prose stylists. Schopenhauer, in some respects, feels like a bit of a dead end in German philosophy. Yet he is a magnificent writer. He's just, even when he's being absolutely atrocious, it's impossible not to really enjoy his rather delicious writing. He's got, and in fact, and Kierkegaard finds this. He actually finds that Schopenhauer's invective, this sheer venom that he spews on people, is actually kind of irresistible. And Kierkegaard too is a major sort of prose stylist. He's a real enthusiast of the Danish language as a literary language and as a philosophical language. When he does his magister's thesis, equivalent to a PhD today, he actually has to petition the king directly to be allowed to write the thesis in Danish instead of Latin. And he wants to do this because he's interested to explore Danish as a philosophical language. His Latin was fine. He still did the defense in Latin, and that went fine. But he actually wanted to write it in Danish because he was an excellent prose stylist. And both, as we'll see today too, as we go through, were very much theorists of suffering. But there's also very fundamental disagreements between the two. Schopenhauer's project is atheistic. It's syncretic. It draws on a range of Indian religious traditions just as freely as it does figures like Kant. Whereas Kierkegaard, for all of his unusualness and all of his kind of, rhetorical flourishes, he's actually very much an Orthodox Lutheran theologian in many ways. And so I actually say in the paper that it's not straining the point too much to say that you get a different soteriology in each. With Schopenhauer, you get an Upanishad-inspired emphasis on the underlying unity of all things, that beneath the world of phenomena, there's will or striving as an underlying noumenal reality of things, which leads to a quasi-Buddhistic vision of suffering, of life as inherently suffering. And then in Kierkegaard, you get a much more orthodox Christian vision of sin and atonement. And yet, we know that the one way encounter that happens between Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer in 1854 is actually quite an interestingly productive one. I'm sorry, I seem to have just gone to the wrong. Sorry about that. I just pressed the space bar. I'll just take that out of the way. So Kierkegaard comes to read Schopenhauer in earnest in 1854. He writes a series of journal entries on the topic, in which he's clearly finding Kierkegaard's clearly finding Schopenhauer incredibly engaging, incredibly entertaining, but he's also kind of repelled by him in some ways. So he finds him really quite beguiling, but also kind of repellent. And so we get these interesting phrases where he says things like, A.S. is undeniably an important writer. He has interested me a great deal, and despite total disagreement, I have been surprised to find an author who affects me so much. And in the margin of this journal entry, Kierkegaard is even struck by those initials A.S. He says, curiously enough, I am called S.A. So we have an inverse relation to one another. Now that's very, very forced. No one calls him S.A. His middle initial is an A. His name is Soren Aarborg Kierkegaard, but no one calls him S.A. S.A.K. maybe. But so it's rather forced. But so he's trying to sort of find these parallels, at least, to explain why he's so kind of uncannily struck by Schopenhauer. Now, given how late this reception of, or this reading of Schopenhauer comes in Kierkegaard's life, scholars tend to disagree on just how influential Schopenhauer could have been on Kierkegaard. Some argue that Schopenhauer has no influence on Kierkegaard whatsoever. He just comes too late in the day to actually have any influence. And the reason that Kierkegaard is struck by the same themes, these themes of martyrdom and asceticism and what authorship requires of someone, he's struck by those themes because he's thinking about them anyway. So when he notices them in Schopenhauer, they're salient for him. There's a whole bunch of things in Schopenhauer that don't actually get mentioned by Kierkegaard. So he's focusing on the things that are relevant to his own writings. Others, even a century ago, Eduard Geismar was arguing that Schopenhauer was even partly responsible for the connection in Kierkegaard's late writings, very late writings in the last year of his life, between asceticism and Christianity, that, to be a Christian is to suffer in the world. Also not to mention things like Kierkegaard's late misogyny and condemnation of marriage. Schopenhauer's a shocking misogynist, which seems to have been driven by his hatred for his mother, Johanna. And you get in Kierkegaard, you get a slightly less overt misogyny, but you get this stuff about marriage, which is kind of misogynistic. But nonetheless, I think that even though the reception comes so late, there is something instructive about Kierkegaard's comments on Schopenhauer. For one thing, it's an incredibly candid insight into what Schopenhauer's reception looked like outside of Germany among his intellectual contemporaries. But also, I feel like Schopenhauer is a kind of a whetstone for Kierkegaard. He forces Kierkegaard, provokes Kierkegaard to sharpen his own stance on what it is for an author to live their authorial project authentically. And ultimately what that authorship and what Kierkegaard's own mission demands of him. In Schopenhauer, he sees a kind of a hypocrite and a kind of a failure, but that sharpens up what he himself is required to do. Now, Scandinavia actually plays a very brief but very outsized role in Schopenhauer's career. So in 1839, Schopenhauer wins an essay. He finds out that the Norwegian Society of Sciences, Royal Norwegian Society of Sciences in Trondheim, so way north in Norway, is running an essay competition on the notion of freedom of the will. That's one of his main areas. So he writes an essay on the basis of the freedom of the will, and it wins the prize. So he's then incredibly excited shortly after that when he learns that the Royal Danish Academy in Copenhagen also have an essay prize they've announced on the topic of the basis of morality. There's a much more complicated essay question that they're asking people to address, but so he's really excited. And he submits his essay to the Royal Academy in Copenhagen. He's still flush with victory from having gotten his essay winning this prize in Norway. He sends it to the Royal Academy. He's so convinced that he's going to win that he says to them, look, if this wins, when it wins, I'll publish them both together in one volume as two essays that have won major prizes by Nordic learned academies. Not only does Schopenhauer not win the essay prize, he doesn't win the essay prize, even though he's the only entrant. So instead of giving Schopenhauer as the sole entrant the prize, they decline to award anyone the prize. 1841, Schopenhauer does publish both of these texts, but instead of saying, yay, this is a great text that was awarded all these prizes by the Scandinavians, instead he basically publishes an absolutely blistering critique of the judges in Scandinavia. Just really vicious sort of invective. He also shows in that introduction, by the way, that the problem here really is that the judges haven't understood their own question. The question itself is badly framed. He has answered the question, but the judges have said he hasn't. And I think actually Schopenhauer's right about that. They hadn't put the question together in a good way. Part of the reason this is interesting to us is that a lot of the names floating around in here are also names connected with Hegelianism, and they're names connected with Kierkegaard's own conflict with the intellectual establishment of Copenhagen. So at some point later on in the piece, Schopenhauer is told by a contact in Sweden that the juror who said no to his essay was Hans Lassen Martensen, the chap there with his hand in his coat pocket, who was an absolute implacable enemy of Kierkegaard's, as well as being one of the leading Danish Hegelians of the day. Martensen and Heiberg were kind of the front of Hegelian hegemony in Danish intellectual life in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. And so this view arises, I think, possibly in Schopenhauer's mind, but also just in commentary more generally, that what's happened is, like Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer has run into a whole bunch of Hegelian partisans who are just horrified that he says such nasty things about Hegel. But now he's actually wrong about this. Martensen wasn't a juror. In fact, he wasn't even a member of the Royal Academy at that time. But the two jurors were Felix Sibben and Jacob Peter Münster. Münster is also an implacable opponent of Kierkegaard's, albeit more of an ecclesiastical opponent of Kierkegaard's. Sibben, much more complicated relationship. It's actually Sibben who writes the judge's decision, and Sibben makes it clear that he's kind of scandalized by the fact that, as he puts it, several distinguished philosophers of recent times are mentioned in such an indecent fashion as to provoke just and grave offense. And Schopenhauer leaps on that as evidence that the judges were scandalized, because he says things like, Fichte is a man whose teaching never left them any time for learning. He calls Hegel a crude, mindless charlatan. He attacks Hegelians, like he says of Mr. Feuerbach, a Hegelian that says it all. Right, so he attacks all of these people, but in fact, it's not so much that. I think it's more just that Münster's a priest. He's a defender of a very particular kind of deontological ethics, and I think he just found Schopenhauer's ethics was just a bridge too far for him. So Kierkegaard's reading all of this stuff, and he's impressed. He's impressed by what he calls Schopenhauer's thunderstorm of coarse epithets. I'm not sure that Kierkegaard works out that these coarse epithets in Schopenhauer's mind are directed at the same people that Kierkegaard's directing coarse epithets at, particularly a year later when he writes that the priests, which includes the professors for him in Denmark, are all cannibals who live off Christianity, which you shouldn't be able to do. I don't think he really realizes that. Also, by the way, one interesting thing there too, Sibben probably knew who the author was. The essays don't have names on them when they're submitted to these prizes, but Sibben was actually aware of Schopenhauer. He may have even briefly met Schopenhauer in Berlin, so he kind of had probably figured out in his head who the author was. But what's interesting is that instead of just enjoying the Schadenfreude, Kierkegaard finds something kind of ridiculous about Schopenhauer getting so upset about this. And he says, representing as he does, and with such a talent, a view of life that is so misanthropic, even though he hates other people, he is so extremely delighted, so seriously delighted, that the Scientific Society in Trondheim, good Lord, in Trondheim, has crowned his essay prize. It does not occur to him that perhaps that scientific society has taken it as a rare bit of good fortune that a German has sent them an essay. by the immortal gods. And when Copenhagen failed to crown another prize essay by Schopenhauer, he rages over it quite seriously in the introduction to the published version. That quite seriously there is really telling, because for Kierkegaard, that points to a kind of performative contradiction. Schopenhauer has this attitude of worldly goods and accolades as being meaningless and something that we shouldn't be pursuing because they won't really bring you happiness. But when he doesn't get these awards, he gets really upset. His attitudes to the goods of life fails to express the aesthetic life view that he himself preaches. And Kierkegaard's kind of struck by the fact that Schopenhauer is really good at irony, and yet there seems to be no irony at all in his own position. But to understand why Schopenhauer never seriously, completely embraces the asceticism he represents or he recommends, we first need to grasp Schopenhauer's understanding of suffering and the problem of suffering that asceticism is meant to solve, and then Kierkegaard's account. For Schopenhauer, suffering is fundamentally a metaphysical issue, right? So suffering is not just, I'm quoting Patrick Hassan here, merely an accidental feature of life which one might eradicate. Rather, suffering is a fundamental feature of what it means to exist as a human being. Remembering for Schopenhauer, the fundamental noumenal reality of the world is the will, formless striving, not will for this or that or for anything in particular, but just will as such, striving as such. And because of that, suffering qua dissatisfaction is basically inevitable. Because we are all just phenomenal expressions of this one underlying insatiable will, that will can never actually be satisfied. So this is kind of an analog of the Buddhist notion of dukkha. The first of the four ennobling truths in the Buddhist teaching is that life is dukkha. That's usually translated as life is suffering, but dukkha actually is more something like unsatisfactoriness, because even pleasure, and this is something that Schopenhauer agrees with the Buddhists on, even pleasure itself is ultimately unsatisfactory because it's fleeting. It goes away. And so Schopenhauer says our goals and our desires always delude us into believing that their fulfillment is the final goal of willing. But as soon as they are attained, they no longer look the same, and thus are soon forgotten, grow antiquated, and are really, if not admittedly, always laid to the side as vanished delusions. So Schopenhauer's view is that even if you get what you want, you'll actually be disillusioned with what you've got almost immediately. He tells us that what we generally call happiness is not really fulfillment at all. It's just cycling through this cycle of desire and satisfaction and disappointment so rapidly that we don't notice that nothing ever really makes us happy. We just cycle through this stuff quick enough that we don't notice that underneath it all lies, quote, a fearful, life-destroying boredom, a wearied longing without a definite object, a deadening languor. Now, Kierkegaard talks about Schopenhauer having this, what he calls an Indian melancholia, or an Indian heavy-mindedness, or Indian gloominess. The Danish there is tungsind, literally heavy-mindedness. In relation to suffering, at least. And what's most gloomy in Schopenhauer's picture is his rejection of the assumption that our frustrations are only contingent. There's something we could, in theory at least, get rid of in earthly life. Now, yeah, one thing that comes to mind here too, I should say, just on this kind of Schopenhauerian view that even our pleasure or our happiness ultimately turns out to be unsatisfactory. I'm actually reminded here of a memoir of F. Scott Fitzgerald's, where he describes driving between tall buildings in golden afternoon light in the back of a taxi and weeping because he realized that he would never be as happy again as he was at that moment. That, you know, he feels incredibly sad because he suddenly realizes that this is the happiest moment of my life and I'll never feel like this again. And that makes him burst into tears. And Schopenhauer likewise tells us our joys are only ever like alms thrown to a beggar that spares his life today so that his agony can be prolonged until tomorrow. Now, Kierkegaard too is really preoccupied with suffering, which reaches its apogee in a series of religious discourses in from 1847, known as the Gospel of Suffering. So he is himself very much interested in suffering. That was, I think, very much a live problem for him too, given his psychology and some of the experiences in his life. He's very interested in the meaning of suffering, the significance of suffering, the uses of suffering. And for him, that's ultimately a theological problem, and one that he addresses in what are ultimately theological terms, and which he addresses in these theological upbuilding texts. But although he is very much a Christian partisan in this argument, he doesn't reject Schopenhauer simply because Schopenhauer is an atheist with an interest in Eastern religion. He says his rejection of Christianity, well, he literally says that's Schopenhauer's business. That's, he's not concerned about that. And he says, even though he's an atheist, he is an author of considerable significance who will be of significance precisely in relation to Christianity. He also quite likes the fact that Schopenhauer, this is a quote, he likes, quote, the fact that Schopenhauer rages energetically against this vile optimism at which Protestantism in particular excels. So even though Kierkegaard himself is a Protestant, there's a certain kind of optimism in Protestantism that Schopenhauer diagnoses, and Kierkegaard actually kind of agrees with that. What Kierkegaard's view here is that where Schopenhauer goes wrong is not in saying that life is suffering, it's in saying that life is necessarily suffering. There are places, and people like Sheridan Huff and others have written about this, there are places where Kierkegaard does say life is suffering, right? He does seem to imply that sometimes. I think he actually explicitly states it a couple of times. But later in his writings, he comes to qualify that. He actually thinks that you can get along pretty well in earthly life if you're not living in Christian categories, right? So if you're just concerned for yourself, if you're trying to live a fairly self-satisfied bourgeois life, not rocking the boat, and you're kind of, accumulating wealth and accumulating goods, he thinks you can live a pretty good earthly life. So you can actually avoid at least some suffering and maybe most suffering. So Kierkegaard's objection to Schopenhauer, or his first objection here, is that it's not that life is suffering, it's that Christian life is necessarily suffering. And he kind of agrees with Schopenhauer when Schopenhauer says that Stoicism is really just another kind of eudaimonism. That the Stoic tries to give up their attachment to earthly things in a particular way that's designed so they can still keep enjoying things, and they're just not upset by things. Schopenhauer thinks, it's actually just another kind of eudaimonism. It's another way of trying to live well in this world, which Schopenhauer ultimately thinks is impossible. Kierkegaard thinks, well, it is possible to live well in this world, but what Christians have to do, according to him, is to what he calls dying to the world. That is, giving up any hope of earthly happiness and goods, and being prepared, and this is the important part here for Kierkegaard, given what happens in the following year, being prepared to die, being prepared to actually suffer and be persecuted and die for the truth of Christianity. This is where we talk about, like, the last couple of years of Kierkegaard's life. No one talks about them much. No one talks about the writings he leaves around 1854, 55, because that's where you get into the real apocalyptic stuff. That's where you get into the real kind of, be prepared to be put to death stuff. So he does like the fact that Schopenhauer is an opponent of Protestant optimism, and also what Kierkegaard calls Jewish optimism in its analysis of the worldly. But he still thinks that ultimately Schopenhauer misses the point. Now, in some respects, it looks like Kierkegaard might be attacking a bit of a straw man here, because it's not the case for Schopenhauer any more than it is for Buddha, any more than it is for the author of the Upanishads, that life is always inescapable suffering. Schopenhauer thinks you can actually, briefly at least, get some respite from suffering through selfless, aesthetic, not aesthetic, which I've been talking about elsewhere, but aesthetic experience, in a certain kind of formless absorption in the world, in which you're kind of just selflessly contemplating things, beauty, or paintings, or the natural world, or whatever. There's some possibility of at least temporary reprieve from the suffering of desire. But this leads to a second objection of Kierkegaard's, an ethical objection, which is that this form of escape from suffering is not open to everyone. Schopenhauer thinks only the sort of higher individuals are capable at all of that kind of aesthetic suspension of the suffering of life, and even then, not all the time. Sorry, I'm just trying to sort of flick through a couple of these just because I know we don't have all that much time. so what basically Schopenhauer tells us at one point that there's, even if the reality of that life is suffering is fundamentally a metaphysical question, it is something that we can get through at least some minimal kind of empirical observation. So he says again in one of these beautifully miserable passages of his, everyone who has woken up from the first dreams of youth, who has paid any attention to his own experience or to that of other people, has looked into life, into the history of the past as well as the present age, and finally into the works of the great writers. Such a person, unless the indelible imprint of some prejudice has crippled his judgment, will certainly recognize the result, that the human world is the realm of accident and error, which have a mercilessly free hand in matters both great and small, and are joined by stupidity and evil in brandishing the whip. Thus it is that everything better makes its way with difficulty, that nobility or wisdom rarely appear or have an effect, or receive an audience, and that the absurd and perverse assert their mastery in the realm of thought, the trite and the tasteless in the realm of art, and the evil and underhanded in the realm of deeds, with only brief interruptions. On the other hand, excellence of any kind is only ever an exception. One case in a million. And even when it manifests itself in some enduring work, then afterwards, once it has survived the rancor of its contemporaries, it continues in isolation. He is very clearly talking about himself here. It is preserved like a meteorite that has come from a different order of things than currently prevails. In other words, for Schopenhauer, it's very easy to conclude that the world is just a resolutely terrible place, and that suffering and privation always have the upper hand. And yet, it seems, for Schopenhauer, not everyone can reach that conclusion. It's not a hard conclusion to reach, but even then, not everyone can do it. Plenty of people still walk around the world thinking foolishly that the world is still a beautiful place and good things can happen to them. Now, this is where Kierkegaard has states his objections here. He says, I have two objections in particular against Schopenhauer's ethics. His ethical view is this: either through the intellect, that is intellectually, or through suffering, the individual comes to see through the entire wretchedness of this existence and then decides either to kill or mortify the lust for life. Here is asceticism. And then contemplation, quietism, is attained through ongoing asceticism. And this is something the individual does out of sympathy, because he sympathizes with the whole of the misery that is existence. Hence, he sympathizes with the misery of others, which is to exist. Right. So, to understand that life is suffering, that everyone is suffering, and also to understand the truth of the Schopenhauerian doctrine that, you know, there is no real distinction between you and me, that we're all basically just phenomena of the one underlying noumenal reality, that makes us sympathetic for others. That makes us concerned for the fate of others and compassionate to others. And that, according to Schopenhauer in the prize essay, is the wellspring of ethics. The problem with that is that you still need to be able to discern this truth, that life is suffering. And that could even just mean you have to have had the good fortune to be alive at a time when it is possible to read Schopenhauer. Now, Kierkegaard has a long-standing suspicion of any argument that links ethical success to special insight or intellectual talent or special ability. That is, he thinks that the ethical necessarily has to be available to anyone. But Kierkegaard thinks that Schopenhauer turns ethics into a matter of genius, right? To actually understand the true nature of things requires genius, or even just the sheer good luck to be able to read Schopenhauer, and to be able to escape suffering requires genius and intellectual ability. And Schopenhauer explicitly says that most people can't do it. Only the smartest people can. So a view of ethics that excludes most agents from taking part in ethics altogether is not, on Kierkegaard's view, a view of ethics that is in any way fit for purpose. It also, interestingly, threatens to engulf Schopenhauer in a fatal contradiction between his moral theory and the normative entailments of that moral theory. In other words, what we should do as a result of that moral theory. In his essay to the Royal Academy, Schopenhauer says that compassion is the wellspring of morality. Quote, only insofar as an action has sprung from compassion does that action have moral worth. And every action that proceeds from any other motives, whatever, has none. But if that's true, says Kierkegaard, then it seems like the very motivation that Schopenhauer claims underlies all morally valuable action should also motivate us to keep this thought to ourselves, right? He says, here I must object that I could almost sooner be tempted to turn things around and to do so, be it noted, out of sympathy. Whether in fact an individual comes to asceticism by way of intellectuality, because he sees through the misery of everything, or more precisely, the misery of existing, or he's brought by way of suffering to the point of letting things come to a total collapse, of breaking with everything, breaking with existence itself, i.e. of breaking with the desire to exist, aestheticism, mortification, which in the face of so many minor plagues, plague after plague, can be a consolation to him, just as when one is unable to perspire in a situation of agonizing heat, it can be a relief when sweat bursts forth. In both cases, I would turn the question this way. Might not sympathy be precisely what would hinder him, prevent him from going to that extreme? Sympathy for those thousands upon thousands who live in the happy delusion that life is joy, and whom he thus would only disturb, make unhappy without being able to help them out to where he is. In other words, if Schopenhauer thinks you have to be a certain kind of genius to escape the suffering of life, shouldn't he keep that thought to himself? Shouldn't he not tell people, if he thinks that, that this knowledge makes us compassionate, then it seems like he should keep quiet about that because he can't actually help most people. So Kierkegaard seems to think that Schopenhauer's theory of suffering is something analogous to what in contemporary ethics we would call a self-effacing theory of morality. A moral theory is self-effacing when it tells us that we should not be motivated by the very motives proper to an action. So, for instance, if we say that selfless altruism is morally justified because it promotes the welfare of all agents, then that's a problem if it also promotes the welfare of the selflessly altruistic agent herself. Michael Stocker has the classic example here of a self-effacing motive. You go to see your friend in hospital. Your friend's delighted that you're there, but then your friend comes to realize gradually that you're not actually there because you're worried about them or because you felt like you just wanted to see them or because you wanted to bring them comfort, but because you realize it's the right thing to do to help your friend. He says that's an occasion there where anyone who says, I'm here to help you because morality demands that I help you, that's actually going to be self-defeating. That's not a good example of helping someone because you're not going to feel helped by somebody who comes to see you in hospital purely because the moral law demands that they do so. And Kierkegaard says, look, there's a risk here. And one of the things that's so kind of captivating about both Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer, one of the things they have in common is they're both really alive to all the ways in which we can lie to ourselves, all the forms in which self-deception can take over our lives, and the way in which we can evade moral demands. Kierkegaard says there is a danger here that you can end up feigning compassion, right? That you could say, well, he says, I will willingly concede, says Kierkegaard, it is terribly easy for the deceptiveness that does not itself dare to the utmost to conceal itself and thus create the appearance of sympathy. In other words, it's very easy to say, well, I could go out and live an aesthetic life, but I'm not going to out of sympathy for other people. Easy enough to evade the demands of Schopenhauer's own theory. And this is, I think, the big objection that Kierkegaard has to Schopenhauer. Not just these ethical objections, not just some of the other problems he identifies, but also that he fundamentally thinks Schopenhauer's a hypocrite. Schopenhauer, as we've seen, counsels a form of aestheticism, right? So give up on all the sort of earthly delights and luxuries and those things. Live simply, have less desire, and you'll suffer less. Very Buddhist, right? And yet, as we've seen, Kierkegaard thinks that it's kind of ridiculous that Schopenhauer is so upset when he doesn't get the adoration of his peers, of learned societies, and the public. He is absolutely desperate to be acknowledged. And so he says, when one has read through A.S.'s ethics, one experiences that, honest as he of course is, he himself is not an ascetic of this sort. He does not practice what he preaches, Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer certainly prides himself on being a genius, yet it has not pleased him or nature to have him become a genius in the area of asceticism and mortification. And Kierkegaard says this is a problem. This is a form of hypocrisy. He says it is always dubious to teach an ethic that does not exercise such power over the teacher that he himself expresses it. Right. In other words, he's saying Schopenhauer's problem is he's preaching a certain kind of attitude to life, a certain approach to life, an approach to earthly goods, to worldly life that he himself does not embody. You might say, well, that's not necessarily a problem. He can simply say, do as I say, not as I do. But Kierkegaard thinks it is a problem. He thinks that, in fact, you cannot communicate an ethical truth unless the teacher himself embodies that ethical truth. And this is where Kierkegaard finds a big distinction between himself and Schopenhauer. Or rather, I think, this is where Kierkegaard wants there to be a big distinction between himself and Schopenhauer. He says, in this respect, A.S. does not resemble S.A. at all, right? He thinks he's trying to say, well, hang on, yeah, Schopenhauer's like this. He doesn't live in his own categories. Well, I do, don't I? After all, I'm really ironical about these things. I don't seek the adoration of the crowd. Quote, I find it inconceivable that so significant a thinker, so excellent an author as Schopenhauer, has so little irony in his character, though he has so much of it in his style, so little of the lightness of superiority, right? He says, I don't understand why this guy is not just ironically mocking things like getting an award from, a bunch of hicks in Trondheim, which is clearly how Kierkegaard thinks of the Royal Society of Norway. And Kierkegaard makes a prediction here. He says, you know what? I understand Schopenhauer is starting to get attention paid to him in Germany. People are finally starting to sing his praises and read his books. He says, well, you know what? If he ever gets the praise that he craves, I wager 100 to 1 that he will be pleased as punch. That it would absolutely not occur to him to cut the garbage down. No, he'll be delighted, right? So Schopenhauer is going to be absolutely the cat that got the cream now that people are saying Schopenhauer was right and he's great, instead of living an ascetic life and saying, I do not care for your worldly accolades. And if you've ever read the introduction to the third edition of The World as Will and Representation, which remember is a book that Schopenhauer wrote in his 20s, and he's just kept rewriting and reworking on and elaborating this one theory, basically his entire philosophical career. He hits on his key idea in life at the age of 26, and he just spends the rest of his working life working that idea out and adding to the implications of it. In the preface to the third edition, he says, I too have finally arrived. And if my influence comes late in life, then I at least have hope that, according to an old adage, it will last all the longer since it was so late starting out. He is insufferable. It's really interesting that he's actually so kind of smug about this. And so Kierkegaard actually quite correctly predicts this. And this is occurring, 3 years after Kierkegaard himself has died. So Kierkegaard maybe doesn't realize in 1854 that he's moving to the end of his life. His health is getting worse. And there is beginning to be, it's not really until 1855 that things really start to happen, but he begins to have a whole bunch of disturbing physiological episodes, temporary episodes of paralysis. He's never been in good health. And so Kierkegaard, even though he finds something kind of, engaging in Schopenhauer, something fascinating in him, he also seems to have in Schopenhauer an example of what not to do. But this is not a comfortable thing for Kierkegaard, I think, because it's sort of saying to Kierkegaard, well, if Schopenhauer is an inauthentic author, if he's inauthentic about his mission, if he's not prepared to suffer in the way that he needs to suffer for his mission, then I, Søren Elborg Kierkegaard, have to be prepared to suffer. I have to do the right thing. So what is the right thing to do? Well, Schopenhauer actually says what the right thing to do should be for Berlin, right? So it should be for Schopenhauer when he's, in his fight against the other professors, for instance. He says, what should he do? He says the problem is that Schopenhauer leads a withdrawn existence, occasionally emitting a thunderstorm of coarse epithets which are ignored. What should he do? Kierkegaard says what he should do is not be a hypocrite. He says, go to Berlin, move the stage for these scoundrels out into the street, endure being the most notorious person of all, recognized by everyone. Then keep up a sort of personal relationship of understanding with these scoundrels so that one sees them together on the street, and so that if possible, everyone knows that they know one another. This, you see, undermines the vileness of ignoring. That is what I have practiced, on a smaller scale, of course, here in Copenhagen. They become fools with their ignoring. And I have even dared to do one additional thing. Precisely because I have been placed under religious command, I have voluntarily dared to expose myself to being caricatured and ridiculed by the whole mob, from the simple people to the aristocrats, all in order to explode illusions so that they will take note of what is being put forward here is not a profane objection that accepts the help of the mob, but a godly objection, which therefore dares even to rebuff the mob when it wants to applaud a victory. Right. To unpack that, Schopenhauer is saying that he's been ignored by his peers, but he still desperately wants his peers to actually kind of, say how great he is. Kierkegaard, because of his religious mission, he feels has also been mocked by the crowd. He picked a fight in the late 1840s with a tabloid newspaper, the Corsair, and the Corsair then basically mercilessly mocked him in a series of caricatures. And so Kierkegaard's view is, well, I've been through the mockery of the crowd. I've been, through a lot of the sort of, the pain of being ignored, but also mocked by the great and good, and also by the everyday people. That's what's happening to Schopenhauer. But the difference is Schopenhauer still wants the mob to like him. He still wants to win them over to his side. Kierkegaard saying, I don't, even when the mob wants to applaud a victory, I want to rebuff the mob, right? I don't want to win my victory on a worldly level, on a profane level. I want to win it on a godly level. And this, I think, this being forced into a reflection on his own practice and what his own practice might demand of him, that ultimately, I think, is where the significance of Schopenhauer for Kierkegaard comes, because it comes at this time when Kierkegaard is about to make his big decisive break. I mentioned earlier Jakob Peter Münster, who was one of the jurors for the committee that didn't award Schopenhauer his prize in Copenhagen. Münster, from what I can gather, didn't write any of the actual judgment. It was all written by Sibbern. But Münster had been Kierkegaard's father's friend and pastor, and he ended up becoming the Archbishop of Denmark. Bishop of Sjælland, this is the default Archbishop of Denmark, so head of the Danish church. And Kierkegaard basically felt that what Münster was selling was an inauthentic version of Christianity, but out of respect for his late father, he didn't actually kind of prosecute this case. He didn't actually kind of criticize Münster at all. Münster died. Hans Lassen Martensen, who we also saw earlier, brought into this story, gives a big funeral oration for Münster, which Kierkegaard correctly recognizes as a job application. He's basically, by making this this eulogy for Münster, he's also trying to stake his claim to be his successor as Bishop of Sjælland, and it works. He ends up getting the job. And in his oration, Martensen calls Münster one of the authentic truth witnesses. He basically claims a kind of apostolic succession for Münster. And that's the last straw for Kierkegaard. He's like, this is ridiculous. He thinks that the church, the sort of official, self-satisfied, comfortable state Christianity that's being pushed in Denmark by the Church of Denmark is unsustainable, is not true Christianity. It's in fact excuse me. Sorry, I've been there's been a sneeze building for ages now. It's just finally overwhelmed me there. He feels like that the sort of Christianity that the Church of Denmark is selling is an inauthentic, watered down lemonade version of true Christianity, and that he feels you need to start pushing back against that. And so in this final year of his life, he begins this big attack on the Danish church. He puts out a whole bunch of pamphlets in which he is incredibly coarse, almost in a Schopenhauerian way, about the Danish church, about the people in the Danish church, about the way in which it has destroyed authentic Christianity in Denmark. They're really quite extreme, some of these writings, certainly by Kierkegaard standards. And it comes as his health is failing, but also he's running out of money. And of course, the only thing he can do for a crust, right? He's a theology graduate. The only thing he could do as a job would be to become a parish priest. But of course, he can't do that now because he's attacking the church in such a vicious sort of way. He can't, he's not making any money off his writings. In fact, he probably loses money off his writings ultimately. And he's about to run out of his father's inheritance. Fortunately or unfortunately for him, Kierkegaard collapses in the street, paralyzed in October of 1855. He's taken to Stokes Hospital, where he tells them, "I'm here to die, and that it's part of my martyrdom as a religious writer that I die in this way." So he's performing a kind of martyrdom. He gets progressively weaker over the next month, and he dies on the 11th of November, 1855. Cause of death at the time, the doctors wrote in the side of the thing, TUBCL ? So tuberculosis. And subsequent generations said, well, that's ridiculous. He had a curved spine and he was, losing control of his legs. Clearly, he didn't have tuberculosis. He had something else. Now, actually, the medical consensus is, yes, he probably did actually have spinal tuberculosis. He had Pott's disease, and that's probably what killed him. It not being something they could treat in 1855. So Kierkegaard does perform a kind of martyrdom in Stokes Hospital. And so I think in that, you could say there's just as Schopenhauer is kind of self-interested and self-regarding, there is a kind of ego in the way Kierkegaard dies. There's a kind of self-awareness and self-conscious egoistic performance in the way he dies to a certain extent. And yet, I think the negative example of Schopenhauer lands in Kierkegaard's life at exactly the right moment, the moment where it sharpens his mind. As I say, Schopenhauer's a kind of whetstone for him to make him think, this is what I have to do, right? If I'm serious about this stuff, then I have to be prepared to die. I have to be prepared for martyrdom. There's rather timely for our pandemic times quote in these journals where Kierkegaard is reading Schopenhauer, which I'll finish up with, where he commends Schopenhauer to his contemporaries as a kind of a counter poison to the cloying optimism that both authors are keen to reject. Counter poison's an interesting term, not antidote, but counter poison. And the quote he says is, just as during epidemics, one puts something in one's mouth to avoid, if possible, becoming infected by breathing the disease-laden air, so could one recommend to students of theology who must live here in Denmark amid this nonsensical Christian optimism that they ingest a little dose of Schopenhauer's ethics every day to protect themselves against infection from this nonsense. But Kierkegaard says he himself does not read Schopenhauer for that purpose because, quote, I am protected in another way. His protection, too, is a kind of counter poison in that it will ultimately kill the patient. What Kierkegaard, I think, gets from Schopenhauer in the end is some of the courage to take that counter poison and to be prepared for death. And that concludes my talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Associate Professor Patrick Stokes, for your presentation on the road to Martyrdom, Kierkegaard versus Schopenhauer.